A young clergyman sat in our rooms at Baker Street, soaked through with rain, and put into my friend's hands a letter that had reached him 10 days after he had buried the woman he loved. Sherlock Holmes read it aloud, slowly in the firelight. You buried an empty coffin. She whom you mourn is not where you think her. If you loved her, do not seek her, for to find her is to destroy her. Let the dead lie, and ask no questions for your own sake and for hers. The young man's name was Edmund Cray. 3 weeks before, he had stood at a graveside in a Norfolk churchyard and read the burial service over his own betrothed. He had seen her fall ill in a single afternoon. He had watched her die in 4 days. He had helped carry her coffin to the ground. And now a stranger's hand was telling him that the grave he wept over was empty, and that if he loved her, he must never learn the truth. I do not know, Mr. Holmes, he whispered, whether I most fear that she is dead or that she is living. That was the beginning of the strangest case I ever knew my friend to take. A mystery not of who had killed a woman, but of why anyone should trouble to bury a coffin with no one inside it. Before it was over, it would lead us into a frost-bound churchyard at midnight, and show me that the coldest facts, rightly read, may serve at the last the warmest of human ends. My name is John Watson. Let me tell you what we found. It began upon a wet and blustering evening in the March of 1889. The equinoctial gales were upon London, and the rain drove against the windows of our sitting room in Baker Street with a persistence that made the fire and the lamplight doubly grateful. Holmes had spent the greater part of the day sunk in his chair with a pile of newspapers about him, cutting and pasting entries into the great commonplace books in which he preserved the record of 1,000 crimes. I had given up my own reading and sat watching the coals, when there came a ring at the bell below, and presently Mrs. Hudson ushered up our visitor. He was a clergyman, not above 30, tall and pale, with the stooping shoulders of a scholar and the fine, sensitive features of a man much given to thought, and, I judged, to suffering. His clerical black was soaked through at the shoulders, but it was his eyes that arrested me, deep-set, dark and burning with a fevered anxiety that seemed scarcely under his control. He stood a moment on the threshold, blinking in the light, as though he had walked far and hardly knew where he was. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I must beg your pardon for coming at such an hour, and in such a state. My name is Edmund Cray. I was, the curate of the parish of Blackmere in Norfolk. I have come to London because I can bear this thing no longer, and because I am told you are the one man in England who may tell me whether I am the victim of a monstrous deception, or of my own madness. Pray sit down, Mr. Cray, said Holmes, with that quiet courtesy he could summon for the genuinely distressed. Draw up to the fire, you are wet through. Watson, a glass of something warm for our visitor. Now, sir, when you have recovered yourself, tell us your trouble from the beginning, and omit nothing, however trifling. It is often upon the trifles that the whole matter turns. The young man took the chair and the hot brandy and water I mixed for him, and by degrees the shivering left him. He gathered himself, and then, in a low and earnest voice, he began. You must understand, gentlemen, that until 3 weeks ago I counted myself the most fortunate of men. I had my work which I loved, and I was betrothed to be married. My betrothed was Miss Alice Merrow, the only daughter of the late doctor. Merrow, who had been physician at Blackmere for 30 years, and died 2 winters since. Alice was the sweetest and gentlest creature that ever lived, and she loved me, poor as I was, though she might have looked far higher. We were to have been married this Easter. "Were to have been," said Holmes gently. "A misfortune has intervened. She is dead, Mr. Holmes." His hands trembled about the glass. 3 weeks ago she was taken ill of a sudden fever. She had been in perfect health. I had walked with her by the mere on the Sunday, and she was as bright and well as ever I saw her. On the Tuesday she was seized with violent sickness and pains and a burning fever. Dr. Aldous Prime, who succeeded her father in the practice, attended her day and night, but she sank rapidly, and on the Friday morning she died. I was with her almost to the end. I saw her lying still. He pressed his hand across his eyes. Holmes waited motionless. She was buried on the following Monday, in the churchyard of Blackmere, with the whole parish in mourning. I read the service myself, God help me. And there, gentlemen, an ordinary tale of grief would end. But it has not ended. It cannot end. For I am haunted, Mr. Holmes, waking and sleeping, I am haunted by the conviction that Alice Merrow is not dead. There was a silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the drumming of the rain. I confess my first thought was that we had before us a case not for a detective, but for a physician, that the poor man's grief had unhinged his reason. Holmes betrayed no such judgment. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his thin face intent. "That is a grave conviction, Mr. Cray. And I do not doubt it is grounded on something more than sorrow. Grief mourns the dead. It does not commonly deny their death. What planted this idea in your mind? Be precise, I beg you. I will tell you, and you shall judge whether I am mad." He set down his glass and clasped his hands. "First, the manner of her illness. I have some little knowledge of sickness, from visiting among the poor, and I had never seen a fever run so strange a course. The violent sickness, the pains, the way she seemed at times almost herself, and then would sink again. But I am no physician, and I set that aside. It was after her death that the things began which I cannot explain. On the day before the funeral, the coffin lay in the darkened parlor of Merrow House. I went to sit with it, as was my right and my sorrow, and I found the lid already screwed down. That is not the custom, Mr. Holmes, when the family and the betrothed wished to look their last. I asked that it be opened, that I might see her face once more. Her aunt, Mrs. Vantage, refused me. She said the doctor had ordered the coffin closed on account of the infectious fever, and that it would be dangerous to open it. Dr. Prime confirmed it. I was too crushed to argue, but it struck me even then as strange. Infectious fevers were indeed a common ground for early closing, Holmes observed. Not in itself remarkable. Pray continue. There was more. On the night before the burial, I could not sleep, and toward 2 in the morning I walked out. My lodging is a stone's throw from Merrow House. As I passed, I saw a light moving in the parlor where the coffin lay, and the shadows of persons within. And I am certain I heard, the sound of tools. A grating, a knocking, such as a man makes with a screwdriver and a chisel. The coffin was being opened, or worked upon in the dead of night, by the very people who had refused to open it by day. I stood rooted in the road. Then the light went out, and I heard a door, and I fled, ashamed of my own suspicions. Holmes's eyes had begun to shine. And then she was buried, and I thought my torment must end with the closing of the grave. But 10 days after the funeral, I received this. He drew from his breast the folded paper, much creased, as though read 100 times. It came without signature, in a hand I did not know, posted from London. You have read it, Mr. Holmes. Now tell me whether I am mad. Holmes turned the paper over, held it to the light, and examined it a long moment with the closest attention before laying it upon his knee. This is a most singular communication, and it has, I take it, decided you to act. It has driven me half out of my senses. For consider, if Alice is truly dead, then this is the cruelest of hoaxes, and someone plays with my grief for sport. But if she is not dead, if the coffin is empty, as this letter says, then something has been done to her, some terrible thing, and she is alive somewhere in some peril, and I have buried an empty box and gone away and left her. He covered his face. I have not slept. I cannot pray. I only know I must have the truth, whatever it costs me, or I shall lose my reason altogether. Holmes sat a while in silence, fingertips together, eyes half closed. Then he opened them and regarded the curate with a look in which, I thought, there was more of compassion than was usual with him. Mr. Cray, I will take your case. There are 2 possibilities, and only 2. Either this letter is the work of some malicious person who wishes to torment you, and your betrothed lies in her grave, or the letter speaks the truth, and there has been a deception of the gravest kind. In neither case can you find peace while the matter stands in doubt. There is but one way to certainty, and it is a hard one. We must look into the coffin. The young man went white. You mean to open the grave? I mean precisely that, when the time is ripe and the proper authority obtained. But not until we have gathered a great deal more, for a graveside is a poor place to be surprised by the unexpected. First, I must know the whole ground. You will return to Norfolk tomorrow, and behave in every respect as a man crushed by grief and resigned to it. You will say nothing of this letter to a living soul, Doctor. Watson and I shall follow within a day or 2, as strangers, 2 gentlemen from London interested in the antiquities of the church, or the wildfowl of the mere. You do not know us. Is that understood? It is understood. Now a few questions before you rest. This aunt, Mrs. Harriet Vantage. What manner of woman, and how came she to Blackmere? She is Alice's aunt on the mother's side. She came about a year ago, when Alice, left alone, needed a companion. A widow some 50 years of age, handsome, capable, very quiet and self-possessed. I confess I never warmed to her. There was a coldness. She seemed always to be watching. And she was not, I think, entirely pleased at my engagement, though she never opposed it openly. Oh, indeed. And what were Miss Merrow's circumstances? A woman of property. The curate hesitated. She was. Her father had done well, and there was besides a legacy from a great uncle in the Indies. She was worth some £12,000. I need not tell you this weighed nothing with me. I would have married her penniless. But I know how it must look, that a poor curate should be betrothed to an heiress. I fear you must suspect my own motives. I suspect no one and everyone, Mr. Cray, until the facts instruct me otherwise, And a man who volunteers the fact that tells against him is not, in my experience, the man I most distrust. Now, upon her death, this fortune, to whom does it pass? I do not know the particulars of her will, if she made one. But in the natural course, I suppose, it would go to her nearest kin, Mrs. Vantage, unless Alice had directed otherwise. And this doctor, Prime, who ordered the coffin closed. He came to Blackmere some 18 months ago and bought Dr. Merrow's practice from the estate. Perhaps 40, clever and well-spoken, popular in the parish. He was much at Merrow House during Alice's illness, and much in Mrs. Vantage's company, now I think of it. I had no cause to think ill of him. Holmes nodded slowly. One last question, and then you must rest. The Grey Tunkle's legacy from the Indies. How long ago did it come to Miss Merrow? The young man looked surprised at the turn. Within the last year, I believe. After Mrs. Vantage came to the house. Why do you ask? Because in matters of this kind, money is very often the root from which the whole dark tree has grown, and I like to know when the seed was planted. That will do for tonight. Sleep if you can, take the first train in the morning, and remember you are a grieving man and nothing more. Leave the rest to us. When the curate had gone out into the wild, wet night, Holmes stood a long while at the window, watching the rain sheet across the gas lamps, his hands clasped behind him. What do you make of it, Watson? A strange and pitiful business. My first thought was that the poor fellow's mind had given way. And yet the letter is real enough. Someone did write it. Someone did write it, Holmes agreed, and that someone is the key to the whole matter. But consider how it is written, Watson. This is not the work of a common hoaxer. A hoaxer bent on cruelty would say she is dead and mock the man's hope. He would not warn him off with a hint that she yet lives and may be preserved by silence. Read the phrase again. To find her is to destroy her. That was written by someone who knows the truth, and who, mark this, does not wish Cray to suffer needlessly, yet dares not tell him all. There is a divided mind behind these lines. There is conscience at war with fear. That, Watson, is the most interesting thing in the whole affair. You believe, then, that the coffin is truly empty. I believe nothing yet. But every fact he brought us leans one way. A young heiress in perfect health, dead of a strange fever in 4 days, attended by a single physician. A coffin closed early against the lover's wish. Tools working in the night. An anonymous letter, 10 days on, declaring the grave empty. And a fortune that passes to an aunt who arrived only after a great legacy had, and who keeps much company with the attending doctor. He turned from the window. But here is the thing that will not let me rest, Watson. Ask yourself the one question that matters. If this were murder, why an empty coffin at all? How do you mean? The murderer wishes his victim in the ground, not out of it. He wants a body, quietly buried and no more said. An empty coffin is not the act of a killer covering a killing. It is the act of someone who needed the world to believe in a death that did not happen. That is something stranger than murder, Watson. And it is precisely why the case is worth our while. His eyes gleamed. Hand me the Bradshaw. Let us see by what train we may follow our unhappy client into the fens. 2 days later, upon a gray and gusty afternoon, We descended from the train at a small windswept station some miles from Blackmere, and completed our journey by hired dog cart across a flat and desolate country. Norfolk in early spring is a melancholy land. Great level fields of dark earth stretching to a low horizon, dikes and drains glinting like pewter under a colorless sky, and here and there the black arm of a windmill turning slowly against the clouds. As we neared the village, the mere came into view, a broad sheet of gray water fringed with tall reeds, over which the wildfowl wheeled and cried, and beyond it the square flint tower of the church rising among bare and wind-bent trees. It was a place, I thought, made for secrets, where the wide sky and the empty land pressed silence upon the human heart. We took rooms at the village inn, the Fenman's Rest, as two gentlemen from town come to study the wildfowl, and as Holmes let fall the fine medieval brasses of the church. Over a supper of cold fowl and ale, Holmes drew from the slow, comfortable landlord, with the easy art I had so often admired, a great deal of the gossip of the parish. We learned that the death of poor Miss Merrow was still the chief talk of the village, that she had been universally loved, that her aunt was thought a hard sort of lady but very genteel, and that Dr. Prime was much esteemed. And then the landlord let fall a thing that made Holmes set down his tankard very quietly. Mrs. Vantage had given out that she meant shortly to leave Blackmere, the house being too full of sad memories, and to travel abroad. To the continent, it was said, or perhaps further. So the bird prepares to fly, Holmes murmured when the landlord had gone. Mark that, Watson. If there is guilt here, it grows uneasy, and means to put the seas between itself and Blackmere. Whatever we mean to do, we must do quickly, for once she is gone, the truth goes with her. The next morning we set about our reconnaissance. Holmes was in his element, tramping the margins of the mere with a field glass, exclaiming over imaginary teal and potsherd, and contriving in the course of our ramble to pass by Merrow House, examine the churchyard, and fall into conversation with no fewer than 5 inhabitants of the village, from each of whom he drew some grain of information. Merrow House proved a solid, comfortable dwelling of red brick, standing in its own garden a little apart from the village, with a look of prosperous seclusion. As we passed, I observed at an upper window the figure of a woman watching us, tall, upright, in black, her pale face and dark, steady eyes following us until we were out of sight. I did not doubt it was Mrs. Vantage, and there was that in her still, watchful attitude which I found strangely disquieting. The churchyard lay about the old flint church, and Holmes lingered there long, ostensibly copying the inscriptions of the ancient tombs, but in truth studying one grave in particular, a new mound of dark earth, not yet turfed, at the eastern end, marked by a simple wooden cross bearing the name of Alice Merrow. He stood over it a considerable time, and once knelt and examined the earth with his lens. The grave was filled in a workmanlike manner, he said quietly as we walked away. But observe, Watson, do you note anything about its position? I looked back. It is at the far end, under the wall, somewhat apart from the other new graves. It is under the wall, Watson, and the wall abuts, on its farther side, upon a lane that runs behind the churchyard down toward the mere. A grave beneath a wall, with a lane beyond. That is a thing to be remembered. Now let us pay a visit to the sexton. The man who digs the graves and the man who screws down the coffins are the two humblest and most valuable witnesses in any parish where death has been at work. The sexton, a wizened and garrulous old fellow named Job Truin, was easily found, and over a pot of ale which Holmes stood him at the inn that evening, easily drawn out. He remembered the burial of Miss Merrow very well. It had grieved him, he said, to bury so young and sweet a lady. Holmes led him gently round to the coffin. "A heavy coffin, I dare say," said Holmes carelessly. "These good elm coffins weigh a deal." "That's the strange thing, sir, now you name it," said old Truan, wiping his mouth. "It weren't heavy at all. Light as anything it were. Me and young Sam, we carried it easy as easy. I says to Sam at the time, she were but a slip of a thing, poor lamb, but even so it were uncommon light. I've buried children as weighed more, seemingly." He shook his head. "But there grief plays tricks on a man's arms as well as his heart, I dissay." Holmes did not so much as glance at me, but I felt the quickening of his attention like a current in the air. "No doubt, no doubt. And the coffin was closed at the house, I hear, on account of the fever. You did not close it yourself?" "No, sir, that were done at the house afore ever I saw it. Doctor. Prime's orders, on account of the infection. Screwed down tight it were, when it come to the church. I did but dig the grave and fill it in." We took our leave of old Truan presently, and Holmes was silent and thoughtful as we climbed to our rooms. "A light coffin, Watson," said he when we were alone. "Uncommon light. Lighter than a child, and closed by no hand but those within the house. It does not prove the coffin empty. A slight woman weighs little, and a frightened man's memory is no scale. But it is a stone laid upon the scale of probability, and it lies upon the side of our client's fear. And now I must see these two people for myself. Tomorrow we shall contrive to meet Mrs. Vantage and Dr. Prime. The reading of faces is a science, and I have a fancy that these two faces will repay careful reading." The opportunity came sooner than we had planned, and in a manner that told us much. That very evening, as we sat over our pipes in the little parlor, the landlord brought word that Dr. Prime had called and begged the favor of a few minutes' conversation with the two gentlemen from London. Holmes raised his eyebrows at me. "So the mountain comes to Mahomet," he murmured. "Our presence has been noted, and it makes someone uneasy. Show the doctor up, landlord, by all means. Doctor." Aldous Prime was a striking man, tall and well-made, with a handsome, florid face, a full brown beard, and an air of bluff good-fellowship that was almost too hearty. He shook us both warmly by the hand, and dropped into a chair with the ease of a man accustomed to command a sick room. "You'll forgive the intrusion, gentlemen. In a little place like this, two strangers from town are an event, and I confess to a doctor's curiosity. Wildfowl and brasses, I hear." He laughed. "But I'll be honest, I came partly to give you a word of caution. There has been fever in the parish this spring. We lost a young lady of it not 3 weeks since, a sad case. I'd not have you gentlemen drinking the well water unwarily. A physician's duty, you understand." "Most kind," said Holmes, with an answering geniality I knew masked the keenest scrutiny. "A fever, you say? Nothing epidemic, I trust. My friend here is himself a medical man, and takes a professional interest." I saw the doctor's eyes flick toward me with a new wariness. "Indeed. Delighted to meet a colleague. No, a sporadic thing. A low gastric fever such as we get in these damp parts. The young lady was carried off with distressing speed, but she was, I fear, of a delicate constitution beneath a fair appearance. These fen fevers are treacherous. They must be, said Holmes gravely, when they carry off a young woman in 4 days. You attended her throughout, day and night, and for the briefest instant something crossed his florid face, a shadow, a tightening about the eyes before the hardy mask returned. Day and night, and could not save her. It is the hardest part of our calling, Doctor, as you know. But there, I'll not cloud your holiday with churchyard talk. You'll take a glass with me. We took a glass with him, and he stayed half an hour, talking easily of the country and the shooting, and probing, I could not but notice, very delicately at our reasons for coming and how long we meant to stay. When he had gone, Holmes sat a time in silence, turning his glass. A clever man, said he at last, and a frightened one. Did you mark how he came expressly to warn us off, to plant in our minds the notion of a fatal fever, and to learn how long we meant to trouble the neighborhood? And did you mark how he flinched, ever so slightly, when I put it to him that the fever had carried her off in 4 days? He does not like the arithmetic of his own story. There is guilt in that man, Watson, but a curious guilt. The guilt of a man who has done a thing he cannot undo and cannot quite justify to himself. I have seen the hardened kind, and I have seen the tormented kind. Doctor, crime is of the second sort. Now I am very anxious to see the aunt. We saw the aunt the following day, and the meeting deepened all my disquiet. Holmes had determined on a bolder stroke. He presented himself at Merrow House as the representative of a firm of London solicitors, come upon a small matter connected with the late Miss Merrow's Indian legacy, a pretext calculated to compel Mrs. Vantage to receive us, and to observe how she bore herself upon the very ground of her secret. I accompanied him as his clerk. Mrs. Harriet Vantage received us in the darkened parlor, the very room, I could not forget, in which the coffin had lain. She was, as Cray had said, a handsome woman, tall and upright, with an abundance of iron-gray hair and features of a cold, classical regularity. She was in the deepest mourning, and carried herself with a composure so perfect that it seemed itself a kind of armor. But her eyes were the eyes of a woman under great and continual strain, dark, watchful, never quite still, and I noticed that her hands, folded in her lap, were pressed so tightly together that the knuckles showed white. Holmes played his part admirably, discoursing of the legacy, of forms and probate, watching her all the while from beneath his lids. And I saw how she grew easier as she perceived our errand was, as she thought, a mere matter of money, and how a faint color came into her pale cheek at the mention of the sum. It is a melancholy business, madam, said Holmes at last, folding away his papers, to administer the estate of one so young and so lately gone. You were her only near relative. Her only one, sir. I came to keep house for her when she was left alone, and I nursed her at the last. It has been a grievous loss. She said it steadily enough, but I saw her hands tighten again. A sudden loss, too, a fever. A fever, yes. Very sudden, doctor. Prime did all that could be done. Her eyes went, for the barest instant, to the window, as though seeking something or fleeing something. You will forgive me if I do not dwell upon it. It is still very near. Of course. One last question, madam. The estate, the legacy, and the rest passes now to yourself, as next of kin, unless the late Miss Merrow left a will directing otherwise. There was a silence. It lasted, I think, no more than 2 seconds, but in that room with the drawn blinds and the cold light and that composed white face, it seemed very long. "My niece made no will that I am aware of," said Mrs. Vantage at last. "I believe I am her heir. But I have given the matter little thought, sir. One does not think of such things at such a time." "Naturally not," said Holmes, rising. "You spoke, I think, of traveling abroad. If so, we should be glad of an address to which papers may be forwarded, that the business be not delayed." Again that flicker of the eyes. "I have not yet fixed my plans. When I do, your firm shall be informed." We took our leave. Holmes was silent until we had walked well away, down the lane toward the mere, with the wind whistling in the dead reeds. "Well, Watson, we have now seen both our principals, and learned a great deal. That woman is guarding a secret that is eating the life out of her. Did you observe her hands? Did you observe how she chose her words about the will? No will that I am aware of. I believe I am her heir. Those are not the words of a woman easy in her mind about an inheritance. And her plans to travel are made, then unmade the instant a stranger asks for an address. She wishes to fly and dares not name a destination. Then it is as we thought. A cold woman, enriching herself by her niece's death. And there, Watson, is what will not fit." He stopped and looked out over the gray water, where a heron stood motionless among the reeds. "There is fear in that woman, deep fear, but there is grief too, real grief and no counterfeit. That does not sit with the theory of a murderess counting her gold. And the fortune she is supposed to have killed for, she has not touched a farthing of it. She can barely bring herself to speak of it. The pieces are all here, Watson. But they will not make a picture. We lack the central fact. Then how shall we find it? There is only one way now. We have gathered all that the living will tell us. It is time to ask the dead." He turned to me, and his face was set. "We must open the grave." It was no light matter, in law or in decency, to open a Christian grave, and Holmes went about it with all propriety. He telegraphed that evening to Scotland Yard and to a county magistrate with whom he had some acquaintance, laying before them in confidence the substance of Cray's story and his own conclusions. And such was the weight of his name that within 2 days the necessary authority was obtained, and the exhumation ordered for the following night, to be conducted quietly, that the parish might not be alarmed nor the guilty forewarned. Inspector Forrester of the county constabulary, a shrewd and silent man, came over to superintend, and Dr. Prime, as the physician who had certified the death, was required by law to be present, a requirement Holmes noted with grim satisfaction. "We shall have all our players upon the stage together, Watson," said he. "The physician who signed the certificate, the officer of the law, the grieving lover who has a right to be there, and I have taken care of it, the aunt, whom Inspector Forrester will invite in the King's name to attend. When that coffin is opened, I mean to be watching not the coffin, but the faces about it. It is there and not in the box that the truth will be written." The night appointed was still and bitterly cold, with a hard white moon riding among torn clouds and a rime of frost silvering the grass of the churchyard. I shall not readily forget that scene, the black flint tower rising against the moon, the wind sighing in the yews, the little group of muffled figures gathered about the dark oblong of the grave, their lanterns throwing great wavering shadows across the tombstones. And the two laborers, breath smoking in the cold, casting up the earth spadeful by spadeful with a soft and dreadful regularity. Cray stood apart, white as the frost, his lips moving as though in prayer. Mrs. Vantage stood very straight and still, her face a mask, but I saw that she trembled continually, and not, I thought, with the cold alone. Doctor. Prime stood with his arms folded, staring into the grave, his florid face gone gray and heavy. Holmes stood a little back from all of them, in the shadow of a great tomb, where he could see every countenance while himself remaining half unseen. At length the spade struck wood. The men cleared the earth from the lid and passed ropes beneath it, and slowly, with much labor, the coffin was raised and set upon two planks laid across the grave. And here occurred the first thing that confirmed all Holmes had suspected, for as the coffin came up, one of the laborers cried out, "Lord bless us, it's light as a feather. There's nothing in her, master, or next to nothing." A shudder ran through the little group. I heard Cray give a low, choking cry. Inspector Forrester stepped forward with his lantern. "Open it," said he. The screws were drawn, and I noted, as Holmes had bidden me note, that they came out easily, as though they had been driven and drawn before. The lid was lifted. Every lantern was raised, every face bent forward. And within it there lay no body. There lay only a quantity of sand and folded sacking, arranged to give the semblance of weight and shape. And upon the sacking, laid where the breast of the dead would have been, a single object, a small sealed packet of oiled silk. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Mrs. Vantage uttered a low moan and swayed, and would have fallen had I not sprung to support her. Doctor. Prime, with a face like death, took one step backward and put his hand to the tomb behind him, as though for support. But it was upon Cray that I chiefly looked, and his face was a terrible thing to see, for in it hope and horror strove together. The empty coffin proved at once that his beloved was not moldering in the earth, and that some deed beyond his imagining had been done. Holmes stepped forward and took up the oiled silk packet. "Inspector, I think we need dig no further tonight. The grave has told us what it had to tell. This packet is addressed," he turned it to the lantern light, "in a woman's hand, and it bears a single line, to be opened only if the grave is disturbed." He looked slowly round the circle of stricken faces. Someone foresaw this hour and prepared for it. I think, before I break this seal, that one or more persons here could spare us the trouble of guessing at its contents. Mrs. Vantage. The woman had recovered herself, though she leaned still upon my arm. She lifted her white face to the moon, and when she spoke it was in a voice of strange and quiet despair. "Do not open it here. For the love of God, Mr. Holmes, for I know now who you are, do not open it here before all these. Let us go within, and I will tell you everything. I am weary of it. I have carried it 3 weeks, and it has been 3 years. I will tell you all." We adjourned, Holmes, myself, Inspector Forrester, Doctor, Prime, the aunt, and the trembling curate to the parlor of Merrow House, where a fire was hastily kindled. And there, in the small hours of that cold morning, the whole strange and sorrowful truth was at last laid bare. "My niece, Mrs. Vantage began, is not dead, Mr. Holmes. You have guessed that. She is alive, and she is safe, and she is far from here, and I pray that what we have done this night has not undone all our labor and destroyed her after all. She drew a breath. To make you understand, I must go back 3 years before ever I came to Blackmere. Alice, when she was scarcely 19, and living still under her father's roof, made a marriage. A secret marriage, a runaway match made in folly and ignorance against her father's certain will, with a man she had met while visiting friends in London. His name was Rupert Slade. He was handsome and plausible, and he swept the poor child off her feet. She married him at a registry office and told no one. Cray had gone very still. Within a month, she knew what she had done. He was a gambler, a drunkard, and worse, a violent man, and a cruel one who had married her, as she soon found, for the fortune he knew she would one day inherit. When he learned that her father lived yet, and held the purse strings tight, and that Alice had no money of her own, he turned upon her. He beat her. He terrified her. And then, being pressed by his creditors, he vanished, went abroad. To America, it was thought, leaving her his lawful wife, bound to him by law and by shame, living in daily dread of his return. She paused, and the fire hissed in the silence. She never dared confess it to her father. He was a proud man. It would have broken his heart. She lived those years in secret misery. And then 2 things happened together. Her father died, and word came through a lawyer in London that Rupert Slade had learned of the deaths in the family, and the fortune now come at last within his reach, and was returning to England to claim his wife. And through her, her money and her person both. For under the law, Mr. Holmes, as you know far better than I, a wife's property and a wife's very body were at that time near enough her husband's to do with as he chose. There was no protection for her, none, against a man who was her lawful lord. And so she wrote to you, said Holmes quietly. I was her mother's sister, the only soul she had trusted with her secret. I came to Blackmere, and I found her half mad with terror. A hunted creature, waiting for the wolf to come to the door. And then, said Holmes more gently still, she met Mr. Cray, and loved him, and could not marry him, being already bound, and could not tell him why. The curate had risen to his feet, ashen, his hand at his throat. Married, he whispered. Alice married, bound to a brute she loathed and feared, said Mrs. Vantage, turning her sad eyes upon him, and loving you, Mr. Cray, with her whole heart, and unable to have you, or to tell you, or to escape. Judge her gently. She was very young when she made her mistake, and she has paid for it beyond all reckoning. But how, I broke in, could an empty coffin mend such a matter? It was Dr. Prime who answered, and his voice was the voice of a broken man. It was I who thought of it. And God knows whether I did right or wrong. I have not slept since. I had come to love Mrs. Vantage. He did not look at her, but I saw the woman's hand move, and something pass between them beyond speech, and through her I knew the whole wretched history. When the news came that Slade was returning, that he had been seen in Liverpool, that he would be at Blackmere within the fortnight to seize his wife and her fortune, we were desperate, Mr. Holmes. There was no help in the law. A wife could not divorce a husband for cruelty and desertion alone. The law as it stood would have given her back to him, body and goods. Flight alone would not serve. He would have followed, and the law would have compelled her return and hunted her wherever she fled, as a wife absconding from her husband. He drew a long breath. There was but one way to make Alice Merrow free of Rupert Slade forever. and that was to make Alice Merrow dead. "And so you feigned the fever," said Holmes. "I feigned the fever. I, who am sworn to heal, used my art to counterfeit a mortal sickness. It was I who tended her, and none but I. The symptoms were of my contriving. Small doses of an emetic, a little coloring, the appearance of decline. I certified her death with my own hand. Between us, in the night, we prepared the coffin, filled it, weighted it, closed it, and buried an empty box with all the parish weeping round the grave. And Alice, who had lain hidden in the attic of this house through it all, was taken away by night, down the lane behind the churchyard. The grave beneath the wall, Holmes murmured. The lane beyond. I marked it, and put aboard a boat upon the mere, and thence by stages to the coast, and thence abroad to friends of mine in Canada, under a new name. A dead woman living, free at last of the man who owned her. When Rupert Slade came to Blackmere to claim his wife, he found a fresh grave and a parish in mourning, and a death certificate signed by a physician, and nothing left to claim. He raged and disbelieved, and made inquiries, but what could he prove against a certified death and a filled grave? He is gone again, we know not where, cheated of his prey. And Alice is safe. There was a long silence. The fire had burned low, and the cold gray light of the winter dawn was beginning to creep about the edges of the blind. And the letter to Mr. Cray, said Holmes at last, very gently. The anonymous letter that told him the coffin was empty, and warned him not to seek her. That was your work, Mrs. Vantage. The woman bowed her head. It was mine. And it was my one act of weakness in the whole business, and it has near undone us all. Mr. Cray loved her truly, and she loved him. I could not bear that he should mourn her as dead all his life, believing her body to lie rotting in the churchyard, when in truth she lived and breathed and thought of him across the sea. I thought God forgive my folly, that I might give him some crumb of comfort, some hint that she was not lost as he supposed, and yet warn him from the truth, since to seek her was to risk drawing Slade upon her track and destroying all. I wrote in the dark of my heart, torn between pity and fear. I never dreamed he would carry it to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. She lifted her eyes to my friend's face, and there was a terrible pleading in them. And now you know all. You hold our lives in your hand, and hers above all. If this comes out, if the truth is published, then Rupert Slade will learn that his wife lives, and will find her, and all our sin will have been for nothing, and she will be given back into the power of that man to be his slave and his victim until she dies in earnest. That is what hangs upon your judgment tonight, Mr. Holmes. That is why I begged you not to open the packet at the grave's side. Holmes had listened to the whole recital without a word, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes veiled. Now he rose and stood before the dying fire, and I saw upon his keen face a struggle such as I had rarely witnessed there. The struggle between the letter of the law, which he had served all his life, and something deeper and older than any law. He turned the oiled silk packet over in his hands. This, I take it, contains a full confession, and Miss Merrow's own account, to be produced if the fraud were ever discovered, that the innocent might not suffer for what you had done. It does, said Mrs. Vantage. It names me and Dr. Prime as the authors of it, and clears all others. We would not have let another suffer for our act. Read it if you will. I do not think I need read it, said Holmes slowly. He looked at Inspector Forrester. "Inspector, the strict facts of this case are these. A death has been falsely certified. A fraudulent burial carried out. A coroner and a parish deceived. These are offenses against the law, and it is your duty and mine to take note of them." He paused. His gray eyes traveled slowly from the broken doctor to the pale, upright woman, to the trembling young clergyman who stood as one who has seen the dead rise. "And yet, Inspector, I will tell you what I see. I see a young woman who as a child was ensnared by a scoundrel into a marriage that made her, by the cruel imperfection of our law, the chattel of a brute. A woman whom that law could not protect, could not free, could only deliver back to her tormentor. I see two people who, from love of her, and finding every honest door closed, chose to break the law rather than see her destroyed by it, and who did so at fearful risk, harming no living soul, defrauding no one of a penny, robbing only a villain of a victim. The inheritance, mark you, was never touched. It lies untouched to this hour. The only person deceived to his hurt is Rupert Slade, who was cheated of the chance to enslave and rob his own wife." He looked round the room. "I have hunted many criminals, Inspector. I know the breed. There are none in this room." Inspector Forrester was silent a long moment. He was a hard man, but a just one, and I saw that Holmes's words had gone home. "Mr. Holmes," said he at last, "I am a servant of the law, and I'll not deny there's a case here a strict magistrate might act upon. But I'm also a Norfolk man, and I've seen in my time what such a marriage can do to a woman, and what the law does to help her, which is nothing. The grave was opened by warrant, on suspicion of murder. And we have found no murder. We have found no body, it is true, but I am inclined to report that our suspicions of foul play were unfounded, and that the confusion in the coffin is a matter I cannot rightly explain and see no public good in pursuing. That is what I shall put in my report, if you concur, and what is written in that packet, and told in this room, need go no further than these walls." "I concur most heartily," said Holmes. And so it was left. The grave was filled in again before the village woke, and the report that went up spoke of an exhumation that had allayed rather than confirmed suspicion, and the matter died, as such matters do, for want of anyone to keep it alive. Rupert Slade, so far as I ever learned, never troubled Blackmere again. He had cheated too many men in too many lands to dare press inquiries that might draw the eyes of the police upon himself, and he vanished at last into that outer darkness where such men end. There remained only the young curate. I do not think I shall ever forget the scene that passed between him and Mrs. Vantage as the dawn broadened over the fens. He had stood through it all like a man in a dream. Now he came to the older woman and took her hands and asked her in a voice scarce audible the one question that mattered to him in all the world. Where was Alice, and might he go to her? Mrs. Vantage looked at him a long while. "She is in Canada, Mr. Cray, under the name of Gray, near a town whose name I will give you when I am sure it is safe. She is free now, for a wife may in time be freed in that new country from a husband who has deserted her, in ways our English law denies. She has taken counsel there, and there is hope, real hope, that within a year or two she may be a free woman in law as well as in fact." A faint, sad smile touched her cold face for the first time. "She never ceased to speak of you. She wept to leave you believing her dead. If you have the courage to cross the sea and to wait, and to keep the secret all your days, then I think there may yet be happiness for you both, when the law has done its slow work and set her free. But you must be patient, and you must be silent, for the shadow of that man will lie upon her until he dies, or until the law dissolves the bond. Can you bear that, Mr. Cray? Can you love a woman you must call by another name, and wait years, perhaps, for the right to claim her? I would wait a lifetime, said Edmund Cray. There were tears upon his face, but there was such a light in it as I had not seen there before. I thought her dead and rotting in the ground. You have given her back to me alive. There is no burden in the world I would not carry for that. We left Blackmere that morning, Holmes and I, and drove back across the flat gray fenland to the little station under a sky washed clean by the night's frost, the wildfowl crying over the mere behind us. For a long while Holmes was silent, wrapped in his traveling cloak, watching the dikes and the windmills slide past. It was I who spoke first. Holmes, I have known you these many years, and I have never known you let a wrongdoer go free before. You have caught murderers by less than we found in that churchyard tonight, and handed them to the law without a qualm. Yet here was a plain fraud confessed, and you have buried it with your own hands, as surely as they buried that empty coffin. Do you not fear you have done wrong? He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke his voice was graver and more thoughtful than was its wont. I have asked myself the same question, Watson, and I will give you my answer, though it is not one I should care to give in a court of law. My business is with crime, and crime is the doing of harm, of injury, of theft, of cruelty, of the taking of what is not one's own. Judged by that standard, tell me, where was the crime tonight? A woman was owned, by the accident of a girlish folly and the barbarity of our marriage law, by a man who meant to use her for his pleasure and rob her of her fortune, and against whom that same law offered her no shield whatever. Two people who loved her broke a rule to save her, and in the breaking harmed no innocent, took no penny, spilt no blood. They defrauded a scoundrel of a stolen prize. If that is a crime, Watson, then it is the sort of crime that shames the law which makes it so, and I will not be the instrument of such a law against such people. The letter of justice would have dragged that woman back to her tormentor and sent her rescuers to prison. The spirit of justice was served tonight in that cold churchyard, and I was content to serve it. And yet, I said, you might have been deceived. You took their story on their word. Not wholly upon their word. A faint smile crossed his lean face. Consider, Watson, how every fact we had gathered fell into its place the moment the true story was told, and how not one fact contradicted it. The strange, lingering fever of an unusual course, the work of a physician counterfeiting death, not of nature dealing it. The coffin closed early, against the lover's wish on a plea of infection, because there was nothing within it to be seen. The secret working of tools in the night, the loading of the coffin with sand and sacking. The uncommon lightness that made the sexton marvel. The grave chosen beneath the wall, hard by the lane that led to the mere, that a living woman might be carried away unseen. The aunt's deep and continual fear, and her grief, which was real grief and no counterfeit, and her strange half-truths about the will, for the fortune was the very thing she dared not touch, lest the touching betray that its owner lived. And above all, Watson, that letter. That divided, pitying, frightened letter, written by one who knew the truth and could not bear the lover's needless pain, yet dared not free him from it. To find her is to destroy her. It was true, Watson, literally and exactly true, in a sense the writer prayed he would never understand. Every clue pointed to just such a story as we heard, and to no other. I did not take their word. I took the evidence, and the word merely told me what the evidence already meant. The train came in then, breathing its steam into the cold, bright air, and we climbed aboard and were carried back toward London and Baker Street, and the ordinary run of our days. But I have often thought of that case in the years since, of the empty coffin lit by lanterns in the frosty churchyard, and the sand and sacking where a young woman's body should have lain, and the small oiled silk packet that Holmes, so far as I know, never opened, but returned unbroken into the hands of Harriet Vantage before we left that house. I heard, some 2 years afterward, in a letter that reached Holmes by a roundabout way and bore a Canadian stamp, that a certain Edmund Cray had married a widow named Alice Gray in a small parish across the sea, that they were happy, that an old aunt lived with them, and that a doctor who had given up his English practice had settled in the same town and prospered. The letter was unsigned, but it enclosed a single pressed flower, a common English forget-me-not, such as grows by the margins of a Norfolk mere. And Holmes, who cared nothing for sentiment and everything for justice, kept it, I observed, pressed between the leaves of the very commonplace book in which he had recorded the case. And there, for aught I know, it lies to this day,